For over 4 decades, the Harrington family had lived in absolute secret. Our understanding of the limits of human degradation would be forever changed by what happened on this 200-acre rural property. Just 16 years old in 1943, Thomas Harrington was forced by his own father, Jeremiah Harrington, to assume marital responsibilities with his mother, Martha, following the patriarch's premature death in a mining accident. A distorted tradition of maintaining pure lineage was what began this story, but it turned into the most unimaginable nightmare a family could live. Hidden between century-old oak-covered hills and surrounded by a constant mist that seemed to protect its darker secrets, the Harrington property was 15 kilometers from the nearest city, Pineville. There, far from the eyes of society, 3 generations lived under rules created by the family's founder, Ezekiel Harrington, who arrived in the region in 1897 obsessed with preserving what he called blood purity. When her husband died in a collapse in the local coal mine in 1943, Martha Harrington was 34. With 5 children to raise and no financial resources, she found herself trapped by the family traditions imposed by her deceased father-in-law. The eldest son, Thomas, was chosen to assume the role of family protector, a cruel euphemism for what would truly unfold over the next 20 years. Described by neighbors as a shy, blue-eyed boy with brown hair, young Thomas had no choice. An environment where resistance was impossible was created by the social pressures of the time, combined with geographical isolation and financial dependence. A union that violated all known social and moral norms was what he was forced to accept. In the early years, the family managed to maintain appearances. While Martha cared for her younger children, Thomas worked the small family farm, cultivating corn and raising a few head of cattle. To the few neighbors who occasionally visited, they were simply a mother and son struggling to survive after a tragedy. But the truth was far more disturbing. With Thomas, Martha had given birth to her first child in 1945. A girl, named Sarah, was born with severe facial deformities and learning difficulties. The devastating effects of consanguinity were already indicated by her physical characteristics: very close-set eyes, a cleft palate, and compromised mental development. In 1947, a boy named David was born, the second child, who developed chronic breathing problems and frequent seizures. More and more evidently, the effects of endogamy began to manifest themselves, yet the family remained isolated, without access to appropriate medical care or external guidance. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades, stories that society preferred to forget but that need to be told to understand the limits of human degradation. By 1950, 7 years after this forced union began, the effects of consanguinity on the Harrington family had become impossible to ignore. Now 41, Martha had given birth to 4 children by Thomas, each with deformities and health problems more severe than the last. The third child, Michael, was born in 1949. Due to malformations in his lower limbs, he could never walk properly. His legs were disproportionate to his body, and his feet had fused toes, a condition known as syndactyly, common in cases of close consanguineous relationships. In 1952, Rebecca, the 4th child, was born with severe microcephaly. A significantly smaller head than normal indicated her compromised brain development. She never learned to speak or feed herself, remaining in a vegetative state throughout her brief life of just 8 years. Now 23, Thomas began to show signs of mental deterioration. The psychological weight of his situation, combined with the pressure of supporting a family under such adverse conditions, was exacting its price. He developed episodes of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of absolute silence and explosions of anger directed at his own children. A scene of progressive isolation was what the Harrington property had become. The children rarely left the farm, and when they did, they wore hats and clothes to hide their deformed features. To prevent the children from exploring beyond the property limits, Martha had developed a rigid control system, prohibiting any interaction with strangers and keeping them busy with housework. In 1953, the local church pastor, Reverend William Patterson, paid an unannounced visit to the Harrington farm. What he found left him deeply disturbed: children with obvious deformities, precarious living conditions, and an environment laden with tension and fear. While Martha explained the children's conditions as God's will, something in the family's behavior alarmed the religious man. A physical resemblance between Thomas and the younger children was noticed by Reverend Patterson, far greater than would be expected in a half-sibling relationship. The family's characteristic blue eyes appeared more intensely, and certain birthmarks seemed statistically impossible in a normal family. When Rebecca suffered one of her common seizures during this visit, Reverend Patterson offered medical help, but Martha refused categorically, claiming doctors wouldn't understand the family's special condition. This refusal raised his suspicions even higher. Local church records indicate that Reverend Patterson attempted further visits in the following months, but he always found the family absent or too busy to receive him. Theories about family curses and divine punishments began to be murmured by the regional religious community regarding the Harringtons. In 1954, the fifth child, James, was born, presenting the most severe set of deformities yet seen in the family. Each of his hands had only 3 fingers. He had heterochromia, eyes of different colors, and developed a cardiac condition that severely limited his physical activities. James rarely cried or showed emotion, remaining in a state of apathy that worried even Martha. A severe drought came to Kentucky in 1958, forcing many rural families to seek government help. Having remained isolated for 15 years, the Harrington family finally had to interact with external authorities when Martha was forced to request food assistance at the Pineville Social Services office. The social worker on the case, Dorothy Mills, was a 45-year-old graduate of the University of Louisville. She was immediately alert when she first saw the Harrington children. Patterns she had studied in cases of consanguinity during her academic training were consistent with their physical deformities. Dorothy noted that Sarah, now 13, had not only facial deformities but also a speech pattern characteristic of severe intellectual disability. David, 11, breathed with difficulty and had frequent fainting episodes. Michael, 9, needed support to walk, and James, 4, remained completely apathetic throughout the interview. Inconsistencies in family documents were discovered by Dorothy during the routine investigation for social assistance. The youngest children's birth records listed Thomas as the father, but no marriage record for Thomas existed. When asked about the children's mother, Martha gave contradictory and evasive explanations. To evaluate the living conditions, the social worker decided to make unannounced home visits. On her first visit in September 1958, she found Thomas and Martha sharing the same room, while the 5 children slept in a room without proper ventilation. A marital relationship between mother and son was clearly suggested by the configuration of the house. About the situation, Dorothy confronted Martha, but she received only vehement denials and threats that the family would move if she continued her persecution. However, the social worker had seen enough to suspect a case of consanguinity and child neglect. It was during this investigation that Dorothy discovered something even more disturbing. Talking to 4-year-old James, the child repeated a phrase he had heard from the adults: "Dad Thomas is Mom Martha's brother." This innocent revelation from a child confirmed the social worker's suspicions about the true nature of the family relationship. The moment you hear an innocent child repeat words that reveal the horror of your own existence is when you realize that some secrets are too heavy to be buried. Leave a comment telling which part of this story impacted you the most so far. Dorothy Mills immediately contacted the local sheriff, Robert Kane, a 52-year-old man who had served the community for over 2 decades. When she shared her discovery, the sheriff initially showed resistance to believing the severity of the situation. While cases of consanguinity were whispered about in rural communities, they were rarely officially investigated. Yet, the evidence Dorothy presented was too convincing to ignore. A disturbing picture that demanded immediate investigation was painted by the children's deformities, the domestic configuration, and James's innocent statement. In October 1958, Sheriff Robert Kane obtained a search warrant to officially investigate the Harrington property. Accompanied by social worker Dorothy Mills and county doctor Dr. Henry Morrison, they arrived at the farm on a hazy morning that seemed to mirror the dark atmosphere they would encounter. Critical to documenting the children's conditions was Dr. Morrison, a graduate of the University of Kentucky School of Medicine with experience in basic genetics. His examination revealed a consistent pattern of congenital malformations that he described as textbook examples of inbreeding depression. Now 13, Sarah had not only severe facial deformities but also progressive scoliosis that was compromising her respiratory capacity. Dr. Morrison documented that her mental age corresponded approximately to that of a 6-year-old child and that she had developed repetitive behaviors characteristic of autistic spectrum disorders. At age 11, David was diagnosed with a congenital cardiac condition that severely limited his life expectancy. His lungs were underdeveloped, and he had episodes of cyanosis, a bluish skin color indicating inadequate blood oxygenation. Without medical intervention, Dr. Morrison estimated David would not live beyond 15 years. Michael, 9 years old, had such severe bone malformations that Dr. Morrison recommended multiple surgeries, procedures simply not available in rural Kentucky medicine in 1958. His legs were of different lengths, and his hips were misaligned in a way that caused constant pain. The most complex set of medical problems was found in James, the youngest at 4. In addition to visible deformities, Dr. Morrison found he had mild hydrocephalus, an accumulation of fluid in the brain, which explained his extremely limited mental development and constant apathy. Under legal pressure and faced with irrefutable medical evidence, Martha finally confessed to the true nature of her relationship with Thomas during the investigation. She admitted that she had been forced by circumstances and family traditions to maintain a union with her own son after her husband's death in 1943. Now 31, Thomas showed obvious signs of psychological deterioration. During his testimony, he alternated between periods of lucidity, where he expressed deep remorse, and episodes of mental confusion where he seemed not to fully understand what had happened to his life. The investigation also revealed that Martha had suffered multiple miscarriages over the years, a common consequence of close consanguinity. Dr. Morrison estimated that, considering the 5 surviving children, Martha had likely been pregnant at least 10 times, with half of the pregnancies resulting in natural losses due to genetic incompatibilities. Regional attention was gained by the case when Louisville newspapers published stories about Kentucky's most isolated family. The local community was divided between those who expressed compassion for the family's tragic situation and others who showed revulsion and demanded severe punishment. In December 1958, the Bell County Court decided to separate the children from their parents. Sarah, David, Michael, and James were placed in different care institutions for children with severe disabilities. Rebecca had died 2 years earlier due to complications from her microcephaly. In January 1959, Thomas Harrington was sentenced to 15 years in prison for crimes against morals and morality, a legal terminology of the time that encompassed incestuous relationships. Martha received a 10-year sentence, but due to her status as a victim of circumstance, she served only 4 years in a psychiatric institution. One of the most documented cases of consanguinity in 20th-century American medical literature became the fate of the Harringtons. Sarah was admitted to Danville State Hospital, where she remained until her death in 1967 at age 22 from respiratory complications related to her congenital deformities. David, as prophesied by Dr. Morrison, died in 1962 at age 15 during experimental heart surgery at the University of Louisville. His death was documented in medical studies on the cardiovascular effects of close consanguinity, contributing to scientific knowledge about inbreeding. Michael lived until he was 25, remaining in specialized institutional care. Despite his severe physical limitations, he developed some basic communication skills and showed affection for his caregivers. His death in 1974 was caused by kidney complications related to his congenital malformations. The youngest, James, surprised doctors by living until he was 31, dying in 1985. Although he never developed mental abilities beyond those of a 3-year-old, he found some quality of life in a specialized institution where he received appropriate care for the first time. After the family's arrest, the Harrington property was abandoned. The wooden house rapidly deteriorated, and nature began to reclaim the land that had witnessed so much suffering. Today, only the stone foundations remain visible, covered by dense vegetation that hides the physical traces of this tragedy. Social assistance policies in Kentucky were significantly influenced by the Harrington case. Dorothy Mills, the social worker who discovered the case, became a national advocate for children's rights and helped establish more rigorous protocols for identifying neglect and consanguineous relationships in isolated rural communities. Released from prison in 1967, Thomas was never able to reintegrate into society. He spent his last years in a small Louisville boarding house, working manual jobs and avoiding social contact. He died in 1983 at age 56 from alcohol-related liver cirrhosis, an escape he had found to deal with the trauma of his life. After her release in 1963, Martha moved to a small town in Tennessee under a new identity. She worked as a housekeeper until retirement and died in 1979, taking her secrets to the grave. She never had contact with any of her surviving children after leaving the psychiatric institution. Important research on the effects of consanguinity in isolated human populations has been contributed to by the Harrington's scientific legacy. Medical studies on the children helped establish early identification protocols for endogamy-related malformations and influenced public health policies in rural communities. This case remains a dark reminder of how isolation, distorted traditions, and extreme circumstances can lead whole families into the deepest degradation. The highest possible price was paid by the Harrington family for traditions that prioritized blood purity over basic human well-being. Asterisk: if you've watched this far, it's because you appreciate this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can get to know you and see who really appreciates the stories here on the channel." Subscribe to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. Leave a like if this story has impacted you, and share it so more people can learn these accounts that society preferred to forget, but that need to be told to understand the limits of the human condition. Asterisk.